Welcome to Startup Stories, where we go behind the scenes of some of the most interesting and innovative tech startups in the world. Each episode will bring you in-depth interviews with entrepreneurs and business leaders sharing their personal stories on success, failure, and everything in between. So whether you're an entrepreneur yourself or someone that's just generally interested in the world of startups, then Startup Stories is the perfect place for you to gain insight and inspiration into some of the most exciting players in the game. So sit back, relax, and join us on a journey of startup stories. Hi, Kasper.
Hey, Jordan.
Thanks for joining me on the Startup Stories podcast.
Thanks for inviting.
So, of course, we're going to have a lot of listeners that don't actually know who you are. So could you give a brief introduction into yourself?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, I'm currently the co-founder of Polimec protocol. So Polimec is a decentralized community-driven fundraising platform for Web3. So, well, that's a very long title. But as such, you can say we help other startups in raising funds on via the blockchain. So we want to do it regulatory compliant, but also full transparent, which is what the power of blockchain is. And I guess one of the interesting thing is also how did I actually end up here? Because talking sort of a bit about startup stories and sort of how I end up in a blockchain startup in Switzerland. Like my initial background is from auditing and accounting. So I started out now many years ago in KPMG as an auditor, and has been through various corporates. I guess the biggest one that people might know would be Maersk, container shipping company, but have after that basically been in startups for the last, what are we talking about, like 8 years or something now. Time flies, and definitely startups is sort of a different beast than what it is in corporate.
Yeah, and that's why I want to get to understand you as the individual behind this startup. So what I'd like to do is, for a man that's accumulated over 20 plus years of experience in startups, finance and compliance, how do I understand you, Kasper? Take me back to your earliest memory from your childhood. What was life like for you?
Earliest from my childhood. Well, that's a long time. That's a very long time ago. I guess it's sort of it's one of these things of basically being curious. I think wanting to try out new things and figuring out how things work. And for me, that's very much of actually some of the things that you probably bring from your upbringing in your childhood and into your adult life. Of if you maintain that curiosity of wanting to constantly learn new things and figuring out how things are working and how can you improve things, is for me very much of the mindset of the entrepreneur or the startup founder, of that basically you can't really help yourself because you see a problem and you figure out a way of like, hey, what can you actually do to address that problem or to change that to change the status quo. So I think that's, for me, is one of the things that if I look sort of from my upbringing of like, hey, how to actually maintain that and how to maintain that as a key value or that drives you forward.
Where did that curiosity come from, Kasper?
Good question. I think it's basically being exposed to different mindsets and to different ideas. I think one of the things remembering from childhood is probably also on what your parents actually are exposing you for, what your family is exposing you for when it comes to like just expanding your scope and your world of and I think some of the memories I have from my childhood is very much also on like going to like vacations where you're sort of, or not even just vacations, but also getting exposed to like to arts, culture, different environments, different people, and sort of not being afraid of what is new and different, but basically trying to get an appreciation for the fact that everybody is different, and that there are various different ways of seeing the world, and being open to that.
If you can still remember, if you could take me back to perhaps when you're an early teenager or sort of in that teenager range, how would you have described yourself back then?
I think probably not extremely sort of outgoing, but more determined and sort of having an idea of where I want to go. And I think one of the things that sort of changed over sort of teenage years and so on is more of how do you get more assertive in who you are and where you want to go, and how do you sort of articulate that in the decisions that you take. And I think that's definitely that. I think one of the things I can remember was like decision of going to high school was very much sort of like, is this the right thing? Should you go to like a more like high school? Should it be more of like a technical education? What sort of fits? And I think that's one of the memories I still have of at that point getting quite assertive with both parents, but also like teachers and so on, of like, hey, this is what I want to do. Even if you think for other reasons that this is the wrong way, then I think this is the right path for me. And sort of being assertive in that way, and trying to shape your own destiny rather than to just go with the flow, but basically saying, hey, I have an opinion about what I want to do, and what can I actually do to make that happen? What are the things you can do to push yourself forward and get you in the position that you want to be in?
So let's talk about your educational background. You chose to study in business and business economics. Why did you choose to go down that path of business?
I originally actually applied to become an architect, and that didn't happen. And then business sort of became the second option. Actually, after taking a year off of just to work and well, basically just have a cut off from studying. Ended up in business school and figuring out what are the opportunities actually there. I think one of the good learnings from that was very much of being at a very small university. I'm originally from Denmark, and the university where I did my bachelor's was basically a branch of a larger university, and I think there was a total of probably 100 or 120 students or something. So a quite small environment, but that also gives you different opportunities. And when you have a large university with tens of thousands of students, you can't actually get as close to professors and educators as you can in a much smaller environment. And it's much easier to actually get involved and be a part of changing things. So being a part of the student board, how to make sure that there's also social events going on, student bars, and all these kinds of things. This is all something that's actually driven out by the students themselves, and I think you need to get involved to make things happen. And I think that was very much a good learning from actually being in a small place, because there's a lot more direct impact on what you do to anything happening. If you have tens of thousands of students, you can just go with the flow, and then you can still be a part of a great community. But when you're in a smaller community, you need to involve yourself a bit more to make sure that you can actually deliver, and that things are actually going in the direction that you want to.
Yeah, I have to totally agree with that. It's much more intimate to have a smaller group. You can learn faster, and I can't remember where I heard this, but they were saying, you're talking from a business point of view, the bigger a company gets, the colder the culture gets, because it's harder to keep the same sort of vibe, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's what actually for me is very interesting with startups is this notion. As long as you have a team that can sit around a table, and maybe a big table. So let's say it's like the startups up to roughly 20 people. It's a lot of a different animal than when you start going above 20 to maybe 100 or 200. That's a different thing. And then when you go past the 100, 200 mark, then it becomes much less personal and much more of a process, a process and a process-based business. And I think that is very much of that. Once you are in a much smaller group and working together on things, it's much more personal and it's much more intimate. And naturally, when things get broader, it just gets less personal and much more of process. And it's a lot easier for everybody, basically just ending up going with the flow and becoming a bit more of an alienating culture, or at least it's something that you really need to be careful about when scaling your startups. Of if you value that intimate culture that you had when you were 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 persons in the beginning, and now you grow to let's say if you were 200, how do you keep the good parts of that culture, and how do you anchor those ones in a large organization? I think that's really where you see a lot of startups are all of a sudden changing culture as they become bigger, and you actually also see a lot of changeover in the people that are involved in startups, which I think actually is a natural progression, because there are a lot of entrepreneurs that really like the small teams and the thing that you have a lot of impact directly. And then when it becomes a much bigger venture with a lot more process, then it becomes natural that you need other people with potentially different capabilities to deliver in that case.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a bit of a catch-22 situation. Of course, most businesses want to scale, they want to grow, but at the same time, you don't want to lose that personal touch. And I think when you start to lose that personal touch, or things start to change, when you can no longer remember everybody by their first name. I think that's one of the first indicators that your business is getting quite big, which is natural. And I guess the only way to sort of solve that is to have managers in departments to make sure they know their team very well, because ultimately people work for a manager, not for a company, and that's what keeps people in a business long term, that I've noticed. Okay, so talk to me about your path that led you to become a co-founder of Polimec Protocol.
So I guess, it all goes back to actually starting out as an auditor, because I was in that part ended up becoming very focused on compliance, on regulatory compliance, both as an auditor, but then also branched out to doing internal audit in quite large corporations. I was 2.5 years in Nortel Networks. That's now it went bankrupt, and at the time I joined, they were on the investigation by the SEC, I think it was an inaccurate filing of their accounts. So not sort of very disruptive environment of trying to figure out what actually happened in this huge company that at the time was, I think, 32,000 employees or something. But a very interesting path to actually get much more into the whole regulatory side of a business and the compliance side of business, of the fact that compliance can end up being a make or break part of your business if you don't pay attention to it. But if you have it as a part of the ground thinking up from your business, then you can incorporate it in what you're doing and making sure that actually, now going back a bit to the culture talk, of that this is actually part of your culture, that you actually have a culture that promotes that compliance. And then after that went in other like larger Danish companies. One called Christian Hansen doing food ingredients. I was leading up the internal audit department at that company that was private equity owned, and that was through an IPO. So very interesting times of actually building up processes and procedures to make sure that the company is actually ready for an IPO. And then subsequent to that went to Maersk, the Danish shipping giant, mainly doing I think right today there's mainly container shipping, but at that time also a lot of oil exploration and oil services as well. And that was sort of where sort of a lot of the my sort of entrepreneurial starts happened there, because Maersk is a huge company with hundreds of thousands of employees, but the part I was in was we were buying and selling fuel oil for the ships in the group. So basically it was commodities trading, and we were a small team of I think 40 people when I started, of trying to figure out how do you optimize these things for this huge organization, but had a lot of autonomy of basically being a startup within a corporation, because commodities trading is something that it's just extremely fast, and the time to decision is really short. So it's something that usually doesn't work well with huge corporates with long paths to decisions. So the setup was much more entrepreneurial, and you could end up trying out a lot of things in that setup of a smaller group. So that had a very sort of entrepreneurial mindset in that at the time, and also figuring out like, hey, how do you actually build a business case? How do you implement? How do you convince others to that this is actually something that's worth going for? And that ended up in me after Maersk Oil Trading did my first startup, which was a GDPR compliance software as a service platform, which were really interesting to build. Learned a lot, used 2 years on it, and then we ended up selling the basic software afterwards, because we never really managed to get the proper product market fit for what we were doing. At the time, it was doing a software as a service solution to smaller companies for doing GDPR, basically being able to do their privacy policies and procedures around compliance with GDPR. But at the time, I think, and maybe even that's still the case today, that you have larger companies that are very afraid of GDPR and privacy data, and then you have other companies that are sort of like, it's okay. And so you end up with coming up with a solution of like, hey, you can do it fairly easy and fairly cost effective, but if the customers on the other side is sort of either they're so afraid that they don't care about paying $100K to a lawyer to fix it, or you have other ones that are like, I don't want to pay you $10 because I don't think it's a problem, then it's difficult to sell a solution that falls square in between these two sort of endpoints. So a very valuable learning, but also I think we ended up with a good product, but the product market fit never really ended up being there. So after that I ended up in Switzerland was looking for actually commodity trading jobs, because this was what I knew from before. But then there was this opportunity with company called Web3 Foundation, about supporting the next generation of the internet, Web3, and making sure that you have a free and open and transparent internet for everybody. And that was sort of my venture into to blockchain at that point. So they were looking for a CFO, and I thought like, hey, this sounds really interesting. It's a startup. It's blockchain, so it's not so fine. It has it would have something to do with capital markets but also something to do with the privacy side of actually coming up with technological solutions that can solve some of the things I worked with before. So I ended up getting the job at Web3 Foundation, and one of the things that Web3 Foundation is doing was issuing both the Kusama and the Polkadot blockchains, which I think Polkadot today is on the top 10 of the largest blockchains out there. So very interesting time, and getting deep into something that's very deep tech. And something that's also very entrepreneurial and something that's quite disruptive in what you can do, and that led me then to Polimec of actually building on top of the Polkadot technology to reap some of the benefits of what I was a part of for the past 4 years, and see, hey, how can we actually make fundraising much more efficient for startups.
So, to make sure I understood you right on the last part, the Polimec idea, did it come off the back of Web3 Foundation?
Yeah, I think it was some of the things that, based on the, you can say it's not as such related to Web3 Foundation, but what Web3 Foundation managed to do with Polkadot is as such, you can say it's infrastructure to build other projects on top. So Polkadot in itself is an interoperability shared security layer for anyone else that wants to build their solutions on top of the Polkadot blockchain. So what you then have on Polkadot is you have a lot of different companies that actually are building their own unique use cases on top of that infrastructure. So it's a bit like. It's a bit like, I think we used before, of like that Polkadot could be sort of like the subway in a city, which is really, really useful if you have a lot of companies building or buildings on top where you have people living in all the buildings. Then the subway is really, really useful. But to make it very interesting and interconnected, you need the subway to make sure you can move people around. So that is sort of the same way of looking at what Polkadot can do for a lot of other startups that are building blockchains on top of Polkadot, is making sure that all these different blockchains can actually talk together. And this is what we are then leveraging with what we're doing on Polimec, of saying that you can talk to a lot of other different blockchains, making sure that you can do fundraising completely transparent, because it's blockchain, so everything is accessible for anyone. But with utilizing other blockchains on the Polkadot ecosystem, we can also make sure that there is a performance of KYC being compliant with fundraising rules and the like.
So it's one thing having a good idea, which we all have. And then there's another thing actually turning your idea into a reality. So what was it about this idea with Polimec that made you think, you know what, let's make this happen. Let's do this for real?
One of the things were actually sort of like, now we talked a bit about my background sort of in compliance and finance, and blockchain is something that I think, at least in the general public, is seen as sort of being very deep tech and very sort of but you need to be a coder to be able to understand it. And I would tend to agree that a lot of the use cases currently on blockchain is very well. You need to be able to at least be curious enough to try to understand the code and how coding works. I think blockchain is now at an impasse of where you can actually start to do real world use cases where you have much more mass adoption, because you have the direct access to the user, so you don't need to be a coder to be able to use it. And for me, with Polimec, was a lot of discussions back and forth with my co-founders of, hey, how can we build it? How can we build the use case around it? What are the incentives that we need to have on the blockchain to do it? And one of the interesting things is a lot of what we are building is a lot more, you can say, financial compliance and game theory based than is necessarily coding based. So a lot of a lot of blockchain is, I wouldn't call it common sense, but a lot of it is incentive structures, making sure that you have the right incentives for people to take the right decisions through the protocol. What you can say is, well, as such, you can say blockchain is making sure that you can have a fully decentralized system, but you need to make sure you have the right incentives for people to work together as a community. Because since it's fully transparent, if there are inefficiencies somewhere, then you have people that potentially would use it because it's fully open, and anyone that can exploit it somewhere for gain over others would do it. So in the essence of designing blockchain is much more of making sure that how do you actually have the right design of your process and the incentive to make sure that it's actually something that provides value to all the users of the chain. So I saw that as being talking about something that's that in the compliance space and in the fundraising space is much more about thinking about how the product should look rather than being able to code it. Of course, you need to make sure that you have someone as well that can code it. But for me, it was like, hey, this is something that not necessarily is extremely deep. Like something that coders need to use 3 years and trying to figure out how to build, but utilizing the power of the underlying blockchain and the deep tech that has been built on Polkadot to actually put a business use case on top of it. So for me, that was like, hey, this is something that I understand, something that I'm passionate about, and this is the opportunity to actually create something that is missing in the space today.
Yeah, it does look very interesting, I must say. And what I wanted to ask, I know that it's only 3-4 months into Polimec, is that right? In terms of its actual launch?
Yeah, well, you can say officially yes, but we've been working with it for a year and a half or something in some way or form, yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Well, so you have that, and of course you have 20 years on your resume with some large corporations as well. From what you've seen and taken it into Polimec, I guess, what would you say is the one most essential key ingredient for a successful business?
I'll go back to a bit what we talked about in the beginning of curiosity. Because if you're not curious, you just go with the flow. And I think you need to you need to have the curiosity to wanting to understand how, well, this sounds very philosophical, but wanting to understand how the world works. And wanting to figure out how can you actually improve that? Like how can you make things easier for users of the product that you're building? And that's not only in the beginning, but I think that's the constant thing that has to drive you forward is curiosity, how to improve, how to make better products. And how to make a difference for your users. That for me is really keen. But also what is really important and why I'm very interested in the blockchain space is that I think we are seeing the change of business models from these like very big global conglomerates of like Facebook, Googles, and so on, to something that's much more community driven. And it really changes the way that you think about a business model, because a business model is to have a successful decentralized blockchain protocol is much more about making sure that people will actually want to use your product, and that you have the right incentives for people to use the product, but also to make sure that then you are sharing the benefit with your community. So today, a lot of the business setup is like, hey, you need to make money so you can pay your shareholders. But if I'm looking at blockchain, it's much more of like if a big community comes together, then they create value together, and that value you can make sure that the value is actually in the hands of the community and not in the hands of shareholders of the company. But it's all the users that actually get the direct benefit of the fact that they are using the blockchain protocols. So I think it's very much of giving that power back to the community of users rather than giving a lot of like profits that goes to shareholders. So for that, I think it's really interesting to see how all of a sudden the focus changes a bit from doing something that can create quick profit to something that actually creates a big community that actually wants to use the product on a long-term basis.
I like when you was talking about, how to create a great product, the curiosity side of things and stuff like that. The thing that stood out for me was when you said about making it easier for the user. And I completely agree with that. I was literally thinking, when I perhaps look at two similar products that do the same thing in terms of the end result, but if one is just so much more easier to use, I don't care how good the other one is, I'm going to use the easier tool, because you want to make someone else's life easier through that product, which I thought was a game-changing point that you made. So I wanted to highlight that for the listener. Great point.
And it's actually it's an interesting thing to talk about that for blockchains, because I think blockchains is always like, but it's difficult and I don't know how to do it and so on. I think that part is also changing for the blockchain industry, because everybody understands that you want to use a great product, but it needs to be easy to use. So the accessibility is definitely something that's really key there. That's one of the things that we are also very passionate about with Polimec, of making sure that you want to use a product, or you want to build a product that people want to use. You don't want to build a product just because it's a great product, but also because it's something that your users like to use and they want to use it over and over again.
Absolutely. So how many people are Polimec now? Is it 10?
So currently we are 10 people. A good mix of people with financial background, people with developer background, and coming together and making sure that you have the right different capabilities to deliver everything that's necessary to get the product off the ground.
So how far do you want to take Polimec? Like how big do you want to grow, let's say, in the next 12 to 24 months?
I think when we're looking at in terms of people, then maybe going to 15, 20 or something like that. But for me, and that's actually one of the things you can do with blockchain, is that you don't necessarily have to have a huge organization to support the product that you're building, because the scalability that you have by using blockchain technology is just there, so you can make a mass market global product from day one. The thing is, it's a challenge, because it always takes a long time to get off the ground, because you need to make sure that you have something that actually works from day one and that is available, open source, transparent, on chain. So it's difficult to do a lot of tinkering, because that's the usual or the traditional way of doing startups is very much of like, hey, you try different things and then you're figuring out what works, and then you get your product market fit that way. On blockchains, in the blockchain world, is slightly different, because it just takes a long time to actually build something you can push out to the market. Just because in a decentralized, trustless infrastructure where you don't have control over what happens. So if you do coding mistakes or something in your product, someone will exploit those mistakes. So you really need to be quite careful in what you're building, and that just requires you to be very much outgoing and talking to your customers upfront to understand what are their requirements, what are the things that they would like, what are the things that what are the things that they need, and what are the things that they actually want to pay for using. So there's a lot more iterations beforehand with partners, potential customers, on figuring out how to build, and then unfortunately it takes quite a long time to get off the ground. But then once you're off the ground, then you have the full scalability, and you can scale a global product with a very, very small team.
Yeah, that's true. I'd say quality over quantity, right? And I think I speak for many businesses. Hiring the right or wrong people can be make or break for a company, because ultimately the business is the people, right? So, and from where you are now, or in general when you've been hiring or plan to hire, would you say is generally your toughest challenge when it comes to finding the right people for Polimec?
Well, it's getting easier now because prices for tokens are not what they have been. So a lot of other blockchains are not necessarily hiring as much as they did before. But definitely getting the right developers with the right passion to do things is really key and can be extremely difficult. There are so many different coding languages out there, and especially when you look at blockchain, there is actually not that many candidates that have experience in that part. So getting the right developers, both for the blockchain part, but also of getting developers that can bridge that gap between like your front end and your user facing side, so the UI UX part and the blockchain, so that you actually can, because your front end and your UI UX this is what your customers are going to see. Of course, there might be someone that also sees the backend blockchain code and are interacting with it directly, but probably 95% of your users are going through your front end app. So that goes back to what you're saying of like, how do you actually build a great product with great usability that people want to use? Not just saying I have the best tech, but I also have the best user interface that people want, that people really want to use. And I don't see actually there is that many that are candidates that are basically covering that, bridging that part, because you really want to make sure that the ones that are doing that are doing your front end and your app is really understands blockchain as well, because otherwise you get it disconnected. So really making sure that you have a kick-ass development team is really important. But then also when it comes to the business development part of how do you make sure you are onboarding the right customers? How do you understand your go-to-market strategy? How do you actually build that up? That is almost equally important, depending on the product, of course, that you're building. But you need users. There's a lot of this idea, especially in blockchain, of like, hey, if we build it, then people will come and use it. To a certain degree, they might. And especially if markets are going up and everybody thinks they can earn a lot of money, then people are going to use something where they think they can earn a lot of money. But for me, that's not the interesting use case. I think for me, the interesting use case is you want to use blockchain for what it can really do of settling trustlessly between parties that doesn't necessarily understand each other. That's why I think a lot of the financial models are good for blockchain, because it's everybody can understand, hey, if I'm paying something to you through my bank, then I do that because I don't like the bank is in between, and I trust the bank to actually transfer the money over to you. If I do it directly on chain, then I can transfer tokens directly between the two of us without having the bank as a trust layer in between. So that use case for blockchain is really is more or less already established. But when you look at other business cases for where you have intermediaries, that is sort of where blockchain technology really come in and actually make a difference. And that's where you need the right business developers, the right curious founders that actually want to disrupt those business models and see where blockchain really can provide value. And I think for me, that's where you can actually take out these trust-based businesses, because you can do things trustlessly and decentralized on blockchain. What drives you to pursue what you're doing with Polimec? I guess in the end, I think it's sort of I've been thinking about it for the last couple of months and so on, that I think I'm sort of like a bit changing sort of some of the beliefs in how you actually are doing business and what actually provides value. Because coming from a lot of big corporates, then a lot of and also corporates that are listed on stock exchange, a lot of it is sort of profit driven. Of how do you make sure you can actually create profits for the next quarterly reports or something like that. Where really what I see in blockchain is that now you can actually change that narrative to create value for your users, and the users will automatically get part of that value if you have the right incentives, and anyone can be an owner of these chains, and that you are then both an owner and a user at the same time. So it's not like you're just a user and then someone else earns money on the fact that you use a product, but you're both a user, but you also reap the benefits of the fact that the network effects on a business creates value for the business. So this whole change to something that's much more community owned, and that Web3 inherently gives you access to own your own data and interact as an individual, rather than you have to interact through these large global conglomerate that we see today. I think for me that is really sort of like something that I think empowers the individual much more, and something that I think will definitely disrupt the business going forward. And that's where I think that Web3 and blockchain actually would come in and play a major role in how we actually see business and growth being driven going forward.
Absolutely. How far do you want to take things with Polimec?
Well, as far as we can go. I think now we're talking fundraising and doing it regulatory compliant, and we have KYC and so on chain. But you can say the technology has a lot more use cases underneath the same umbrella. So fundraising, definitely that's sort of our first the first path we are going for. But definitely have other ideas to how to utilize the same narrative of taking away the middleman, making markets much more transparent and accessible for anyone, but still making sure that you do something that's compliant, that protects the users as well, and that you really have something that is a long-term infrastructure for regulatory compliant DeFi in the blockchain space. Amazing.
Looking forward to watching Polimec's journey and seeing how far you guys really do take it. Now, there's obviously going to be a lot of people listening. You've got, as I say, 20 plus years of experience in the game. What one bit of advice would you give to the listener if you could?
I think going back to some of the things we talked about, I think it's definitely staying curious, challenge the status quo, and figure out what, like, if you see inefficiencies, then what are you going to do about it? Like, I think today there's a lot of there's a lot of chatter on social media and so on, and people are like, this is not nice, and this is not nice, and everybody talks about things that they don't like or things they want to change. But I think it's sort of like being curious and standing up there and actually do something with it, and actually be that change maker for pushing things forward. Because talking doesn't necessarily take you too far, but starting to build a startup and build products that people want to use that actually are solving real pain points is really something that we need. And I would hope that we see more people that are willing to take that chance and go out and actually build something they believe in, rather than just staying a bit on the safe side. And then it's like, I have a good job and it has a good income and this is fine and sustainable. But sometimes also be a bit curious, go out there and take a bit of risk, and see what you can drive in it, and then believe in that yourself can be that change maker that can actually build something that makes a difference for a lot of people.
Kasper, I have to say I 100% agree. I think it's curiosity which leads to great ideas and ideas to explore new avenues. So curiosity is definitely the key message of this podcast. I want to thank you for joining me on the Startup Stories podcast. I look forward to, as I say, following your journey and see how Polimec get along.
Thank you very much for having me. It was very nice.
No worries. Take care, my friend. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Startup Stories. I hope you enjoyed hearing from our guests and learning more about their journey in the startup world. I'll be back soon with another exciting episode featuring a new guest, so make sure to subscribe to Startup Stories so you never miss an episode. Also, don't forget to follow me on social media for updates and additional content. And if you have any suggestions for guests or topics you'd like to hear about, please reach out to me. And as always, I appreciate your support and feedback. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.